Hey guys, before we begin tonight, I want to take a genuine moment to thank the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and I mean this sincerely. The ideas you send in are the heartbeat of this channel. Every time someone drops a suggestion in the comments, it shapes what gets made next, and that connection is something I don't take lightly. This one came in, and I knew immediately we had to explore it. So thank you. Truly. If you're new here and you enjoy drifting through history at a quiet, unhurried pace, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps more than you know, and it keeps this little corner of the internet alive. And for those of you who prefer to listen on the go, the channel's now on Spotify. The link is waiting for you down in the description. Take us with you wherever you wander. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull a blanket up. Put a fan on if that's your thing, that soft white noise that makes the whole world feel smaller and safer. Get comfortable, really comfortable. Tonight we're not in any hurry, because we're going somewhere worth taking slowly. Have you ever wondered what a Tuesday morning actually felt like in 1963? Not the television version, not the nostalgia poster version, but the real thing. With its particular smell and its particular sounds and its unspoken rules that everyone just seemed to know. What did it feel like to wake up in a house where every surface had a purpose and every hour had a shape? What did a woman think about as she pinned her hair before breakfast, before her husband had stirred, before the coffee had finished percolating on the stove? What invisible weight did she carry through those bright, spotless kitchens? What was she allowed to want? What happened if she sat down before everyone else had been served? What happened if she laughed too loudly at a dinner party? What happened if her slip was showing at the grocery store? Or her lipstick had faded by noon? Or she used the wrong fork at the church potluck? These are real questions, and they have real answers, and just like that it is 1962. The percolator has just finished its first cycle. Somewhere down the street someone is already hanging laundry on the line. Your girdle is on. Your pearls are waiting on the dresser. The day has barely begun, and already there are rules to follow. Let's find out what they were. Let's start with the morning, because in the 1960s the morning was not your own. It belonged to the household, to the schedule, to the quiet, relentless expectation that you would appear at the breakfast table looking presentable, unhurried, and pleasant, as though you had not been awake since 5:30 ironing a shirt that nobody would notice. You wake before your husband, before your children. In the pale grey light before the neighbourhood fully stirs, you dress yourself, pin your hair, and apply just enough makeup to look natural, which takes considerably longer than it sounds. There is a word the women of this era use without irony. Put together. And the rules around what that meant before 8 in the morning, before a single cup of coffee has been finished, would make your head spin. The bedroom is still dim. Your husband sleeps soundly, one arm across the pillow, breathing in the slow, unhurried rhythm of someone who has not yet considered the day. You move carefully, quietly, the way women of this era learn to move in the early hours, as though the morning itself is a guest who must not be disturbed. The floorboards creak in one particular spot near the closet, and you have memorized it. You step around it without thinking. Your house dress is already chosen. It hangs on the back of the door where you placed it the night before, a small act of preparation so automatic it barely registers as a decision. You dress in the half-dark, working by feel and habit, smoothing fabric over your slip, fastening the buttons from bottom to top the way your mother taught you, then the mirror. There's always the mirror. You sit at the small vanity and work through your face with quiet efficiency. Foundation patted into place, a dusting of powder, the soft drag of a pencil along your brows. Not full makeup, this is morning, not a social occasion, but enough. Enough that if a neighbour came to the door at 7:15, you would answer it without embarrassment. This was the unspoken standard that governed the early hours of a 1960s Housewives' day. Not glamour, not performance, simply readiness. The idea that a woman should never be caught undone, even in her own home, even before sunrise, was so thoroughly absorbed by this generation that most of them would have struggled to explain it if you had asked. It was simply how things were, how things should be. The alternative, shuffling to the kitchen in a robe with unpinned hair and a bare face, belonged to the category of things a well-managed household did not permit. Downstairs now, the kitchen is cool and slightly dark. You turn on the light above the stove rather than the overhead, a gentler option, one that eases you into the day without the shock of full brightness. The percolator goes on first. The sound of it, that soft rhythmic burble climbing toward a boil, is one of the most comforting sounds in the world, and you stand near it for a moment simply because it is warm. Breakfast must be ready when the children come down. Lunches must be packed before the school bus comes. The kitchen must look, by the time your husband pours his first cup, as though it has been quietly, competently tended by someone who finds all of this perfectly natural. The remarkable thing is that most of them did find it natural after a while. The routine became the rhythm, and the rhythm became the day, and the day became the life. And somewhere inside that life, between the mirror and the percolator and the lunchbox lined up by the door, was a woman who had simply decided that being ready was the same thing as being fine, and so she was. It is breakfast time now, and already the table is either right or it is wrong. In the 1960s, a properly set table was not a nicety. It was a moral statement. The fork on the left, the knife on the right with the blade facing inward, the spoon beside it, the glass at the tip of the knife, the napkin folded just so. These were not decorating choices. They were the visible proof that a woman knew how to run a home, and by extension, knew her place in the world. Women's magazines of the era published entire features on the correct distance between a fork and a plate. Etiquette guides devoted full chapters to the order in which dishes should be presented and the precise angle at which a butter knife should rest. Getting it wrong, even slightly wrong, was the kind of thing a neighbour might notice and remember. The table itself was its own language, a breakfast table set with a cloth rather than bare wood said something. A table with matching napkins, even paper ones folded into a neat rectangle, rather than left in a loose stack, said something. The placement of the salt and pepper shakers, centred and within reach of everyone, said something. Every detail was a small broadcast about the kind of household this was and the kind of woman who ran it, and women of this era read those broadcasts fluently in each other's homes without ever acknowledging they were doing so. For dinner, the rules deepened considerably. You could spend a full afternoon preparing a table for a formal dinner party and still find something you had forgotten. The butter plate belonged to the upper left of the setting. The water glass sat above the knife. The wine glass, if wine was being served, perched slightly to the right of the water glass, close enough to suggest abundance but not so close as to seem cluttered. Salad forks, when there were salad forks, went to the outside left. Dessert, silverware might be placed above the plate horizontally or brought out with the dessert course, depending on which etiquette guide your mother had consulted and how formal the occasion was deemed to be. You learned this young. It was the kind of knowledge passed down at kitchen tables and in dining rooms, not through formal instruction but through proximity. You watched your mother set a table 1,000 times before you did it yourself, and by the time you had your own home, the choreography was in your hands, automatic and exact. The stakes felt real because they were real, or at least they were real within the world these women moved through. A table set incorrectly for a dinner with your husband's colleagues said something about you that could not be unsaid. It lodged itself quietly in the evening, a small splinter of doubt about your competence, your upbringing, your attention to the things that mattered. And here is the part that is worth sitting with for a moment. These women did not resent the table, not most of them, not consciously. They took a genuine and particular pride in getting it right. There was satisfaction in the symmetry of it, in the neat order of silver against white cloth, in a table so properly arranged that a guest would sit down and feel, without knowing exactly why, that they were in good hands. The table was a form of care. It was the housewife's first silent promise to the people about to gather around it. I thought of you before you arrived. I prepared this place for you. Everything here is exactly as it should be. That promise, offered in linen and silverware, was one of the quiet dignities of the era. Step outside this kitchen for a moment, because the rules about a woman's appearance extended far beyond the home and deep into every corner of her public life. In the 1960s, a woman without lipstick was considered underdressed in a way that carried genuine social consequences. Not lipstick was shorthand for she has let. Her self-go and letting yourself go was one of the quiet catastrophes a housewife was supposed to spend her life preventing. Women kept lipstick in their aprons, in their glove compartments, in their purses at all times. They reapplied before their husbands came home from work. They freshened it before answering the front door, even if the person at the door was just the mailman. The colour had to be flattering, but not provocative. The application had to be neat, but not theatrical. It was, like so many things in that era, a performance calibrated to disappear into expectation. There was a specific ritual around the 5 o'clock reapplication that was so widely practiced it might as well have been written into the domestic schedule. Your husband's car in the driveway was the signal. You checked your hair. You smoothed your dress. You stepped to the mirror in the hallway, or the small compact you kept in the kitchen drawer, and you freshened your face. Not because you were performing for him exactly, though that was part of it, but because the woman who greeted her husband at the door should look like a woman who had managed the day, not been managed by it. The compact itself was a kind of talisman, small, usually powder blue or tortoise shell, snapping open with a satisfying click that signalled intention. You learned to reapply in seconds without a mirror if necessary, a skill that came from years of practice in dim restaurant bathrooms and car visor mirrors, and the brief, stolen moment between taking your coat from the church pew and stepping into the aisle. The colour mattered more than it might seem. Too bright and you were fast, a word whose meaning in that era carried considerable social weight. Too pale and you looked washed out, unwell, as though the household had been running you rather than the other way around. The ideal was something in the middle, a reliable coral or rose, the kind of colour that photographed well and read as wholesome from across a room. Women stayed faithful to a single shade for years, sometimes decades, the way you might stay faithful to a recipe or a perfume. What is remarkable, looking back from here, is how completely this expectation was absorbed without being questioned. The lipstick was not considered oppressive, not by most of the women who wore it. It was considered appropriate, which was the highest compliment available to a woman's behaviour in this era. And appropriate meant that you had understood the social contract and were honouring it, that you had taken yourself seriously enough to present yourself seriously, that you respected the people around you enough to be put together in their presence. There is something in that, even now, that is worth taking seriously. These women understood presentation as a form of consideration. They dressed for the world around them, not only for themselves. Whether the rules they were working within were fair is a separate question. But within those rules their care was genuine, and the lipstick was its small, daily visible proof. There is something almost forgotten about the way women were expected to move in the 1960s. The physical choreography of femininity that was so thoroughly taught it became invisible. A woman entering a room was not simply a person walking through a door. She was making an entrance, whether she wanted to or not, and the rules around how that entrance should look were precise and unforgiving. She should enter quietly, not timidly. There was an important difference. She should not precede her husband unless the hostess directed her to. She should not burst in, should not look around too eagerly. should not search the room for familiar faces with what etiquette guides called an expression of want. She should arrive as though she already belonged, calm, composed, self-contained, a soft and graceful presence drifting into a space that had been waiting for her. The posture was everything. Shoulders back, not thrust. Back in a military way, but settled, lowered, easy. Head level, chin neither lifted in a way that read as pride nor dipped in a way that read as uncertainty. Hands quiet, perhaps one holding a small clutch, the other relaxed at your side or loosely holding a glove. Nothing hurried, nothing effortful. The woman who entered a room correctly looked, above all else, as though she had never in her life felt the need to rush. You practiced this, consciously or not. It was one of those skills that accumulated invisibly through years of watching and being watched. You noticed the women who did it well, the ones who arrived in a room and somehow made it feel as though the room had been quietly waiting for them, and you absorbed the geometry of how they moved without quite knowing you were doing so. The rules for entering a room also governed what came immediately after. You did not immediately begin speaking. You did not cross directly to a friend on the other side and ignore the people in your path. You made your way into the room gradually, greeting people as you encountered them, the way a river finds its way to the sea, without forcing, without rushing, following the natural geography of the space. You acknowledged your hostess first, always. That was non-negotiable. The hostess was greeted before anyone else in the room, her home honoured before any personal connection was pursued. If your husband was with you, you moved beside him, rather than ahead of him, slightly behind and to one side, a positioning that the era read as wifely grace rather than subordination, though the line between these two things was narrow and worth noticing. You entered together, but he entered first, and you followed in a way that looked like accompaniment rather than trailing, which required a subtle skill that women of this generation made look entirely effortless. What strikes you now, reading these instructions in the old etiquette guides, is how much energy went into appearing not to be trying. The entire performance was designed to look like the absence of performance. The woman who entered a room correctly was invisible in the best possible way, present without imposing, graceful without drawing attention to her grace. She was simply there, warmly, properly, exactly as she should be. It took years to learn, and it was never, ever mentioned. Here is something that seems almost comical now, but was entirely serious in its time. In the 1960s, there were rules about whether a woman was allowed to initiate a handshake. Whether she could offer her hand first to a man she was meeting depended on the situation, the setting, the relative social ranks of the people involved, and an invisible web of expectations that took years to learn. A woman, according to the dominant etiquette guides of the era, should generally wait for a man to extend his hand before offering hers. To reach out first was considered presumptuous, even aggressive, a subtle crossing of a boundary that most people couldn't have named but would immediately have felt. And yet a woman who failed to shake hands at all, who held back too long, who seemed reluctant, risked being read as cold or aloof or unfriendly. The correct posture was to hover, to wait, to read the room perfectly and respond with just the right degree of warmth at just the right moment. Between women, the rules shifted. Two women meeting socially might shake hands or they might not. A light clasp, brief and warm, was acceptable. A firm, business-style handshake between two women in a social setting was considered, by the standards of the day, slightly mannish, a word that functioned as both description and mild rebuke. Women shook hands in the way they did most physical things in that era, delicately, briefly, with a softness that communicated warmth rather than authority. The grip itself was calibrated. Too firm and you were aggressive, too limp and you were weak. The etiquette guides, with their particular gift for making the obvious seem technical, described the ideal handshake as firm but yielding, which is the kind of instruction that sounds precise until you try to follow it and realize it describes an emotional state more than a physical one. Women who navigated this well were the ones who had simply been in enough rooms to develop a feel for it, an instinct for when to offer, when to wait, how firmly to close their fingers around another person's hand. There was a glove complication as well, because there almost always was in this era. If you were wearing gloves, the rules changed again. Outdoors, a woman could shake hands while gloved. Indoors, the glove should ideally come off first, unless the occasion was extremely formal, in which case there were separate sub-rules depending on the length of the glove and the nature of the gathering. Women carried these distinctions with them the way they carried their compacts, automatically without display, reaching for the right response before the situation had fully arrived. What is worth pausing on is the sheer amount of social calculation compressed into that single moment. The offered hand, the received hand, the grip, the release. In the span of 2 or 3 seconds, a woman communicated something about her upbringing, her confidence, her social position, and her understanding of the room she was standing in. And she was expected to get it right every time in any setting, with any stranger, while also smiling warmly and saying something pleasant. It is the kind of thing you stop noticing when you grow up inside it, and the kind of thing that becomes extraordinary the moment you step outside. Let's talk about gloves, because in the early 1960s, gloves were not a fashion choice. They were a uniform, and the rules surrounding them were baroque in their specificity. White gloves for daytime social occasions, longer gloves for evening events, cotton gloves for summer, fabric gloves for church. You did not shake hands while wearing gloves unless you were outdoors. You did not eat while wearing gloves. You did not remove them and hold them crumpled in your fist, which was considered graceless. You removed them finger by finger, folded them gently, and placed them in your purse or your lap. The women of this era navigated glove etiquette the way a chess player navigates openings, instinctively, automatically, and with the constant awareness that an error, however small, would be noticed by someone. The gloves themselves were kept with care. You did not throw them in the bottom of a bag. You did not stretch them by pulling them on roughly at the wrist. You worked them onto your hands gradually, starting at the fingers and smoothing down toward the palm, easing the fabric into place with a patience that the rest of the day rarely allowed. After wearing, they were turned right side out, smoothed flat, and stored somewhere clean and dry, because a woman who let her gloves wrinkle was a woman who was not attending to the details, and the details were always the thing. White gloves presented their own particular challenge. They showed everything. A smudge from a door handle, a faint shadow from a pencil, the ghost of a morning's errands, all of it visible on white cotton in a way that nothing else in your outfit could reveal. Women who wore white gloves regularly developed a specific kind of vigilance about their hands, a consciousness of what they touched and how, an awareness of surfaces that most people never needed to cultivate. You learned not to lean against walls, not to touch your face, not to handle anything that might transfer colour or oil. The gloves made you careful in a way that was also its own small form of discipline. There was a ceremony to putting them on before leaving the house that felt in its way like a final punctuation mark on getting ready. The dress, the shoes, the hair, the lipstick, and then the gloves drawn on slowly and smoothed into place. And suddenly, you were finished. You were dressed. You were, in the fullest sense the era understood, prepared to be seen. By the mid-1960s, gloves were beginning to loosen their grip on daily life. Younger women were leaving them behind, part of a broader softening of the formal dress codes that had governed their mothers' wardrobes. But for the women who had grown up with gloves as a requirement, letting them go was not entirely simple. They had worn them so long to so many places that going out without them felt faintly underdressed for years afterward. a small nakedness that took time to stop noticing. Some of them never quite stopped noticing. Some of them kept a pair in their purse until well into the 1970s just in case. It is Sunday afternoon now, and someone in this neighbourhood is hosting. The smell of a roast has been drifting through the block since morning. The good china is out. The table is set with military precision, and somewhere in the kitchen the hostess is making sure that everything is exactly right, while simultaneously making sure that no one notices she is doing so. Because here was one of the most quietly exhausting rules of the 1960s. The hostess must appear effortless. She must never be seen struggling. She must not look tired. She must never sit down before her guests, never serve herself first, never abandon the table to attend to something in the kitchen without doing so smoothly and invisibly. She was supposed to be everywhere and nowhere, managing without managing, present without intruding, a hostess so skilled that her guests felt genuinely relaxed, as though the whole beautiful afternoon had simply arranged itself. She had been up since early. The roast went in before 8. The potatoes were peeled and waiting in cold water in a bowl by the sink. The dessert, something with a pastry crust that required more attention than it would ever receive credit for, sat cooling on the counter under a cloth. The flowers on the table had been cut from the garden and arranged twice, the first arrangement slightly wrong in a way she couldn't name but could not leave alone. The second was better. She stood back, tilted her head, decided it would do. By the time the first guests arrived, the kitchen had been wiped down, the apron removed, her hair touched up in the hall mirror, and the hostess herself had crossed the invisible threshold between preparation and performance. She greeted people at the door with genuine warmth. She took their coats. She offered drinks with the ease of someone who had not spent the last 4 hours in a kitchen, which was exactly the impression she intended to create. The rule about not sitting down first was only the most visible edge of a much larger expectation. The hostess served. She circulated. She refilled glasses before they were empty and cleared plates with a timing so practiced it went unnoticed. She laughed at the right moments and steered conversations away from uncomfortable territory and made sure that the quieter guests were drawn in and the louder ones were gently, graciously contained. She did all of this while also eating something, though usually less than everyone else, because eating required sitting, and sitting required stopping, and stopping felt, to a skilled hostess of this era, faintly like abandonment. When the last guest finally left and the door clicked closed behind them, the house exhaled. She exhaled. She stood in the dining room looking at the table, the beautiful wreckage of a successful afternoon, stacked plates and rumpled napkins and glasses bearing the small lipstick marks of a dozen different women. And then she began to clear it quietly, alone, in the good shoes she'd been wearing for 6 hours, because the kitchen would not put itself right. There was pride in that too, real pride. The meal had been good, and the afternoon had been warm, and not a single guest had seen the seams. That was the achievement. Not the roast itself, but the seamlessness. The invisible labour made to look like love, which in its way, it was. Being a guest in 1960s, America carried its own elaborate weight of obligation. You arrived within 5 to 10 minutes of the invited time. Never early, because early was an intrusion, and never more than a few minutes late, because late was a slight. You brought something. You didn't come empty-handed unless you'd been explicitly told to, and even then, most women brought something anyway. A small arrangement of flowers, a tin of biscuits, a bottle of something modest and appropriate. You admired the home. You accepted what was offered. You did not request substitutions, did not push food around your plate in a way that might signal dissatisfaction, and did not decline a second helping so abruptly that the hostess felt her cooking had been judged. And when the evening was finished, you wrote a thank you note by hand within 2 days, or the friendship quietly suffered for it. The flowers, if you brought flowers, required their own small calculation. Too extravagant, and you made the hostess feel she had to find a vase worthy of them in the middle of an already busy evening. Too modest, and they read as an afterthought. The ideal was something middle in size and charm, cheerful without demanding attention, something a person could accept with genuine pleasure and set on a sideboard without ceremony. Carnations were reliable, dahlias in season, chrysanthemums in autumn. You did not bring flowers that needed arranging. You brought flowers that were already arranged. At the table you watched and followed. If the hostess picked up her fork, you picked up yours. If grace was said, you bowed your head and waited. You did not begin eating before the hostess, and you did not finish too far ahead of her, which required a calibration of pace that experienced guests had long since made automatic. You ate what was served. If something was not to your taste, you managed it without drawing attention to the fact, moving it around the plate with the gentle sleight of hand that polite guests had practiced since childhood. Compliments were offered at the right moments, not all at once in an overwhelming rush at the beginning, but distributed naturally through the meal. A small appreciation for the soup, a genuine remark about the tenderness of the roast, a word about the table itself, how lovely it looked, how much care had clearly gone into it. These compliments were received by the hostess with deflection and quiet pleasure, and offering them correctly was as much a skill as any other part of the evening. What strikes you now is how collaborative the whole thing was. The hostess performed her role and the guests performed theirs, and together they produced something that felt, at its best, like genuine ease. The rules were the scaffolding behind that ease, invisible when everything went well, glaringly apparent when something went wrong. A guest who arrived empty-handed, who pushed food away, who sat without helping clear and reached for a second glass without being offered, was not simply rude. They had broken the agreement, the quiet understanding that everyone around the table was working together to make the evening feel like something worth remembering. Most people kept that agreement without thinking about it, because that in its way was what it meant to know how to behave. In the 1960s, the handwritten thank you note was not optional. It was not a charming extra. It was a fundamental unit of social currency, the small paper proof that you were a person of good breeding and genuine gratitude, and its absence was a failure that people remembered. A woman who did not send thank you notes after a dinner, after a gift, after any gesture of hospitality, was not merely rude. She was, in the quiet ledger that neighbours kept, unreliable, unpolished, the kind of woman whose upbringing had perhaps not quite taken. The notes themselves had rules, blue or black ink only, personal stationery if you had it, specific praise for the evening or the gift rather than vague pleasantries, and a handwriting that was legible but not showy. Women kept stationery the way they kept good towels, for company, folded and waiting, a signal that the household was prepared. The note was written within 48 hours. This was the outer limit, and most women of this era adhered to it with the same seriousness they brought to returning library books or keeping a dental appointment. To let 3 days pass was to enter uncertain territory. To let a week pass was an oversight that required additional effort to repair. The longer you waited, the more elaborate the apology folded inside the note needed to be, and an elaborate apology drew more attention to the lapse than a prompt and simple note would ever have done. The stationery itself communicated before a word was read. A note written on a card, printed with your name or your initials, said something specific about you. It said you had considered this possibility in advance, that you had purchased stationery at some point when you were not in a rush, that you took correspondence seriously enough to equip yourself properly for it. Women who sent notes on generic cards from the drugstore were not judged harshly for it. Practicality was respected. but those who had their own stationery were thought to possess a particular kind of social intention, a readiness that was quietly admired. The language of the note was its own art form. You named what you were thanking someone for specifically. The lamb was exceptional, or the evening was one of the loveliest we've had all year, or the children's gift was opened immediately and has been played with constantly since. These specific details were the proof that the note was sincere, not a formula, but a genuine reflection of a genuine occasion. Thank you note that said, "Only thank you so much for a wonderful evening" was considered weak, a technical compliance with the form without the substance that gave it meaning. You learn to write these notes young, sitting at a kitchen table the day after Christmas or a birthday, labouring over the careful sentences while your mother looked on and occasionally offered a quiet correction. It was one of those childhood obligations that felt tedious at the time and revelatory later, when you understood that what you'd been taught was not just politeness but attention, the discipline of noticing what someone had done for you and taking the time to say so clearly. That discipline, learned at a kitchen table in the 1960s, was one of the most useful things those mothers ever passed on, even if it took decades to fully understand why. There is a particular kind of silence that belonged to 1960s American social life, and it was the silence around money. You did not ask what someone paid for their home. You did not mention what your husband earned. You did not comment on the price of anything, your own possessions or anyone else's, in a way that seemed calculating or covetous. If something was admired, you accepted the compliment graciously and said nothing about its cost. If you had less than the people around you, you dressed and behaved as though you did not, and this was not considered dishonest. It was considered dignified, and if you had more, you were careful never to let it show too plainly, never to let your comfort become a kind of cruelty in a room where someone else was quietly stretching a budget to keep up. Money was everywhere in the 1960s, shaping every decision, every neighbourhood, every table. It simply was never spoken of directly. The rule applied in both directions with equal force. You did not complain about finances in social company, because complaint was an imposition, a way of making your difficulty someone else's problem and requiring them to respond to it. But you did not boast either, and boasting did not require large statements. It could be accomplished accidentally with a single sentence, a passing mention of a vacation destination, or a new appliance or a renovation project that immediately recalibrated the comfort level of everyone else in the room. Women of this era were exquisitely sensitive to these miscalibrations. They felt them instantly and silently, and adjusted their own conversation accordingly, editing themselves in real time so that the gap between households remained invisible, even when everyone in the room knew perfectly well that it was there. The house itself was the primary site of this negotiation. You maintained whatever you had with pride. A modest house kept immaculately was never a source of shame in this world, because upkeep was within a woman's control even when square footage was not. A window box of flowers, a swept front walk, a doorstep that gleamed on a Saturday morning. These were the signals a woman sent about herself and her household, and they could compensate, socially at least, for a great deal. The woman whose small house was beautifully tended was accorded the same quiet respect as the woman whose larger house sat behind a longer driveway. The effort was the thing. The effort was always the thing. Children presented a particular complication, because children had not yet learned the silence. They said what they saw, named what they noticed, asked the questions that adults had long since trained themselves never to ask. A child who announced at a neighbour's kitchen table that their family had just bought a new television, or conversely that their father had been out of work, could undo months of careful social calibration in a single sentence. Mothers managed this as best they could through advance instruction, quiet reminders in the car on the way over, a hand on a small shoulder that communicated without words. not here, not now, not that. What you're left with, looking back at this particular silence, is something complicated. The rule protected people from cruelty, from the casual thoughtlessness of those who had more. But it also prevented honesty, the kind of honesty that might have allowed women to help each other more directly, to share the real shape of their days rather than the polished version. The silence was a kindness. It was also a wall, and most of the women who lived behind it never thought to question whether the wall was necessary, because the wall was simply part of the house, and the house was simply home. Here is something that sounds, from where we stand now, almost unbelievable, and yet it was simply the water that women of that era swam in. At formal dinners and gatherings in the early 1960s, it was considered poor form for a woman to introduce a topic of conversation unprompted, particularly one of any substance. She could respond, she could elaborate, she could laugh at the right moments and ask thoughtful questions and guide a conversation gently toward pleasanter ground if it drifted somewhere awkward. But to arrive at the table and begin holding forth on politics, or business, or anything that might suggest she had strong opinions and intended to share them, was to mark herself, to become the kind of woman that other women raise their eyebrows about later. The most admired women in formal social settings were described as charming, which often meant in practice that they had been brilliantly strategic about what they said and, more importantly, what they did not. The dining room at a formal dinner had its own acoustic geography. The men gathered at one end of the conversation and the women at the other, not always physically, but socially. The topics sorting themselves by an invisible gravity that everyone felt and nobody named. Business, politics, sport, these drifted toward the men. Home, children, recipes, garden, these gathered around the women. And a woman who reached across that divide, who offered an unsolicited opinion about the election or the economy or the state of foreign affairs, felt the temperature of the room shift in a way that was impossible to misread. This did not mean the women had no opinions. That would be the simpler story, and the wrong one. The women at those tables were often extraordinarily well-informed, voracious readers of newspapers and magazines, careful observers of the world around them. They discussed politics freely with each other, in kitchens and on telephone calls and over the back fence on Tuesday afternoons, when no formal occasion required them to manage their words. They had views, they had arguments, they had the particular clarity of people who had spent years watching from the outside of a room and therefore understood its interior workings better than those inside it. They simply knew when to offer those views and when to hold them, and a formal dinner was not the occasion. The occasion required a different performance, one of receptive warmth, of intelligent response, of the kind of gracious listening that made the person being listened to feel that they were the most interesting person in the room. Women who excelled at this were considered wonderful company. They were invited back. Their husbands were complimented on their wives, which was the primary currency of that particular social economy. The skill required to hold an opinion quietly while appearing genuinely engaged is not a small one. It requires patience and self-possession and a kind of internal stillness that takes years to cultivate. The women of this generation had cultivated it so thoroughly that it became, for many of them, a permanent habit of mind, a default setting that persisted long after the formal dinners were over and the world around them had changed enough to welcome their voices. Some of them found, when the world finally asked for their opinions directly, that they had to learn all over again how to give them plainly, without the softening, without the deflection, without the careful social architecture they had spent decades constructing around every thought they had. It was harder than it sounds, and it said something important about what it cost to spend years being the most charming person in the room, step out of the dinner party now and into something more ordinary, because the rules followed a 1960s housewife everywhere, even to the grocery store, even on a Wednesday morning with a list in her purse, and nothing on her schedule but this errand and the next one. She did not go to the grocery store in curlers. She did not go in house slippers or an apron. She did not go in anything that suggested she'd come directly from domestic labour, even though that was precisely what she'd been doing all morning and would return to all afternoon. She dressed to leave the house, which meant she dressed well enough to be seen, well enough that no one could look at her and think, "That poor woman." The grocery store was public. Public meant observed, and being observed meant maintaining the carefully constructed image of a woman who was managing everything beautifully, without strain, without visible effort, with grace. The list was prepared at home, organised by aisle if you were experienced at it, which most women of this era were. You did not wander the grocery store. Wandering was inefficient, and inefficiency was its own kind of failure. A suggestion that you had not thought ahead, had not planned the week's meals, had not managed the household calendar with the attention it deserved. You moved through the store with purpose, selecting what was on the list, occasionally making a considered substitution if the butcher recommended something, or the produce looked better in one variety than another. The produce selection itself required knowledge. You pressed gently at the shoulder of a melon to test its ripeness. You checked the undersides of tomatoes for soft spots. You lifted heads of lettuce and assessed their weight, their density, the colour of their outer leaves. This was not browsing. This was expertise, accumulated over years of cooking 3 meals a day for a family, of learning the hard way what a good piece of fruit looked like and what the disappointing kind felt like in your hand, an hour into supper preparation. You knew the butcher by name, you knew the produce manager, you exchanged pleasantries that were genuine but brief, because lingering too long suggested you had nothing to get home to, and a woman with nothing to get home to was, in the social arithmetic of this era, a woman without enough to do. The conversations were warm and efficiently concluded, the social equivalent of a firm but yielding handshake. The other women you encountered in the aisles were neighbours, acquaintances, members of the same church or the same school parent committee. You greeted them, you admired their children if their children were present. You did not comment on what was in their cart, because a cart was a private document, a record of a family's preferences and budget and weekly habits that was not meant to be read by strangers. You glanced, of course. Everyone glanced, but you said nothing. You paid, you collected your bags, and you returned to your car with the week's groceries and the quiet satisfaction of an errand correctly executed. The house was waiting. The afternoon was scheduled, and you had moved through a public space and emerged exactly as you had entered, composed, appropriate, a woman who had things well in hand. The grocery store was a small theatre, and you had played your part without a single missed line. The rules about how a woman sat in the 1960s are a study in the physics of propriety. Knees together, always. Ankles crossed, preferably. Back straight, not rigid, but upright enough to signal attentiveness and good posture without looking, like you were trying. A woman didn't lean back in her chair at a social occasion. She didn't sprawl. She did not occupy space in a way that spread her presence outward. The ideal posture was contained, composed, a body folded inward in a way that communicated consideration for the space of others. Girls were taught this by their mothers, who had been taught by their mothers, an unbroken inheritance of physical self-restraint that was considered elegant rather than restrictive. And the women who sat that way, hour after hour through long dinner parties and church services and school concerts, carried that posture with them even now, even decades later, some of them still unable to sit any other way. The chair itself mattered. At a formal table you sat forward slightly, close enough to reach the place setting without leaning, far enough back that the chair supported your spine rather than the table supporting your arms. You did not hook your heels on the chair rung. You did not tuck one leg beneath you, which was reserved for the privacy of your own living room, if even there. You did not angle your body away from the person speaking to you, because the body's direction communicated interest or its absence, and a woman at a social occasion was always interested, always attending, always present in the fullest physical sense of the word. In the living room, the rules softened slightly, but did not disappear. You could sit back more comfortably on a sofa, could allow your shoulders to lower, could hold a cup in your lap rather than leaning forward to reach the coffee table. But knees together remained, always. It was the one constant that no setting relaxed, a small bright line between composure and carelessness that women of this generation observed as automatically as they breathed. The ankles crossed rule had a practical dimension that the etiquette guides did not always acknowledge directly. The skirts and dresses of the 1960s, even the more relaxed, daytime styles were not designed for sprawling. They were designed for sitting correctly, their drape and their length calibrated for a specific posture, and a woman who sat wrong in a dress of this era knew it immediately from the way the fabric pulled or rode or refused to fall as it should. The clothes themselves were a reminder. They demanded the posture, and the posture completed the clothes, and together they produced the effect that both the designers and the etiquette guides intended. Young girls absorbed all of this long before they could have articulated it. They sat beside their mothers at church and at the homes of relatives and in waiting rooms, and they watched and they adjusted, and eventually they stopped having to think about it at all. The posture became the body's default, a resting state that felt as natural as standing. It is only from the outside, looking back, that you begin to understand what a precise and total thing it was, the lifelong physical habit of taking up less space than you might have, of containing yourself, of sitting as though the world around you deserved your consideration more than your comfort did. In the 1960s, one of the quietest rules of marriage was the expectation that a wife would be interested in her husband's world. Not merely polite about it, genuinely, visibly, actively interested. She was supposed to know enough about his work to ask intelligent questions at dinner, to listen attentively when he described his day, to receive his frustrations and his small victories with equal warmth, and to do this without making the conversation about herself or her own day unless he asked, which was not guaranteed. Women's magazines of the era ran regular features on the art of being a good listener, tips on how to draw a man out, how to ask the right follow-up questions, how to make him feel heard without making the evening feel like an interview. The result was a generation of women who became extraordinarily skilled at a very specific kind of conversation, the kind where you're almost invisible and yet entirely necessary. The magazines were specific in their advice, and the specificity was striking. One popular guide suggested a wife ask her husband about his work within the first 15 minutes of his arriving home, before the children demanded his attention, before the news came on, in that brief window when he was still carrying the day with him and could be invited to set it down. Another suggested keeping a small mental list of questions prepared in advance, things you had genuinely wondered about his work during the day, so that the conversation would feel natural rather than dutiful. The line between the two was everything. She learned the names of his colleagues. She remembered their ongoing difficulties, their promotions, their wives' names and their children's ages. When he mentioned someone from the office, she knew who that person was, could place them in the hierarchy, could ask a follow-up question that demonstrated she'd been listening the last time this name came up. This was not performance, or rather, it began as performance and became, through repetition, something genuine, a real knowledge of a world she never entered but inhabited second-hand through the nightly ritual of dinner conversation. In return, the magazines assured her a husband who felt listened to was a husband who was content, and a content husband was the foundation of a stable household, which was the foundation of a good life, which was, in the logic of this era, the primary goal a woman was working toward. The listening was not a sacrifice, it was an investment, phrased always in the language of love but structured underneath by something more pragmatic. What the magazines did not address, or addressed only in passing, was the other side of the ledger. What happened to the woman's day, to her frustrations and small victories, to the interesting thing that happened at the school gate or the troubling phone call from her mother, or the novel she'd been thinking about all afternoon. Those things existed. They simply existed in a different conversational register, one that belonged to other women, to the telephone and the kitchen table and the neighbour's back step, not to the dinner table, not to the evening hours that belonged to him. She learned to be interested in his world because her world had no formal place at the table, and because she was, in spite of everything, often genuinely interested. The two things were both true at once, and the women who held them together without bitterness were, in their quiet way, remarkable. The phrase children should be seen and not heard was already old by the 1960s, but the particular form it took in post-war suburban America had its own texture and its own rules. Children were expected at social gatherings to behave in a way that reflected well on their mother, which was the key part of the equation. Their manners were her manners. Their behaviour at a neighbour's house was her behaviour, her management, her success or her failure made small and legible in the form of a 6-year-old who sat quietly and said please and thank you and did not interrupt. A child who squirmed, who spoke too loudly, who reached for something before being offered it, was not just a child being a child. He was an accusation, the faint suggestion that perhaps his mother was not quite as capable as everyone had believed. The preparation began before leaving the house. You sat them down, the older ones at least, and you went through it. You used your quiet voice. You do not interrupt when adults are speaking. You say hello when someone speaks to you, and you look at them when you say it. You do not ask for food. You wait until it is offered. You do not run inside someone else's home. You do not touch things that do not belong to you. These instructions were delivered not as a list of punishments waiting to happen, but as a briefing, a preparation for a performance that both mother and child understood mattered. Some children absorbed this naturally, took to good manners the way they took to everything else they learned, with a straightforward willingness to do what was expected. Others required more. For those children, the mother developed a vocabulary of silent communication so precise it functioned as its own language. A particular look across a room, a slight pressure on a small shoulder, the clearing of a throat at a specific pitch that meant not now or stop, or we will be discussing this in the car. Children who grew up in these households became extraordinarily fluent in the language of their mother's signals, reading her expression from across a crowded living room with an accuracy that years of practice had made automatic. The expectation carried with it a genuine tenderness, which is important to hold alongside everything else. These mothers were not indifferent to their children's comfort. They were fiercely invested in their children's futures, in the social capital that good manners would provide, in the doors that opened for children who knew how to move through the world with grace. The manners were a gift they were giving, even when the giving felt to the child like constraint. And the truth is that many of those children grew up grateful. They carried those early instructions into adulthood and found, to their mild surprise, that the world responded warmly to people who said please and thank you and looked someone in the eye when they spoke. That the discipline of waiting, of not reaching, of listening before speaking, turned out to have uses far beyond the neighbour's living room. The mother had known that all along. She had simply not had the words to explain it at the time, so she had explained it with a look and trusted that the understanding would come later. It usually did. It is evening now, and the cocktail hour has arrived. That particular institution of 1960s suburban life that existed somewhere between unwinding and performing. because even in the privacy of a social drink there were rules, especially for women. A woman could accept a cocktail. She could hold one. She could sip it with measured grace at a dinner party or a backyard gathering. But the rules about how much and how visibly were as carefully calibrated as anything else in her social life. A woman who drank too eagerly, who laughed too loudly after a second drink, who seemed to be enjoying herself in an unguarded and unself-conscious way, was noticed. A woman who didn't drink at all, who declined everything with a prim little shake of the head, was also noticed, though differently. The correct performance was somewhere in the narrow middle, holding the glass with ease, taking modest sips, remaining charming and warm without ever seeming to need the drink. The cocktail itself was selected carefully. In the early 1960s, the repertoire of acceptable drinks for a woman at a social occasion was narrower than it is today. A gin and tonic was reliable, a whiskey sour was acceptable, a glass of wine, once wine became more common at suburban dinner tables, was considered appropriately feminine. A woman who ordered something strong and dark and neat, who drank what the men were drinking and in the same quantity, was transgressing something that most people in the room would have felt without being able to articulate it precisely. The glass was a prop as much as a vessel. A woman at a party holding a cocktail looked comfortable, social, at ease. She had something to do with her hands, something to offer when conversation paused, a reason to bring her glass to her lips in a moment that might otherwise require her to fill the silence with words. The glass gave her a graceful way to manage the rhythms of a social evening, and the women of this era understood its function intuitively, carried it lightly, set it down cleanly. What you noticed at these gatherings, if you were paying attention, was the pacing. A woman who'd been at a party for 2 hours and was still on her first drink was admired, quietly, by the other women in the room. It took a certain kind of discipline, particularly on an evening when the drink was good and the company was warm and the week behind you had been long and wearing. But the discipline was its own social signal, a small proof of self-possession that registered with everyone even though no one mentioned it. The morning after a dinner party was when the evening was reviewed, over the telephone, in the careful language of women who were saying more than they appeared to be saying. She seemed to be enjoying herself was a phrase with a specific range of meanings depending on the tone. She was very relaxed could mean several things, none of them entirely complimentary. The ledger of the previous evening was settled in these morning conversations, quietly and completely, and a woman who had held herself well knew it would be noted just as she knew the alternative would be noted too. It was a narrow path, as most paths for women in this era were, wide enough to walk if you were careful, easy to stray from if you were not. Here is a rule so small it seems almost invisible until you see how deeply it shaped behaviour. In the 1960s, a woman did not simply say thank you to a compliment and move on. The correct response to being told your dress was lovely, or your roast was wonderful, or your home looked beautiful was to deflect, to minimize, to redirect the credit somewhere else, toward the fabric that had been on sale, toward your mother-in-law's recipe, toward the light in the room that was doing all the work. A woman who accepted a compliment directly, who said thank you, I love it too, or thank you, I worked hard on that, was considered at best lacking in modesty and at worst proud, which was one of the less forgivable things a well-bred woman could be. The dance of the deflected compliment was considered a social grace, a small performance of humility that kept the room comfortable and the woman inside appropriate limits. The deflection had its own grammar, and you learned it early. Oh, this old thing was the standard response to a compliment about clothing, delivered with a light laugh and a small downward glance at the garment in question, as though you were mildly surprised anyone had noticed it at all. I just threw it together was another, used for meals that had required most of the previous afternoon to prepare. The house practically runs itself. offered in response to a compliment about the home's order and beauty, with no acknowledgement of the extraordinary amount of running you had done to produce that effect. The skill was in making the deflection sound genuine. A mechanical disclaimer, delivered too quickly or too smoothly, had a hollow ring that experienced company could detect immediately. The ideal was something that sounded like a spontaneous thought, a real moment of modest surprise at being noticed, as though the compliment had caught you off guard even when you had, at some level, anticipated it. This required a specific kind of performance, natural in its texture if not in its origin, and the women who did it best were the ones who had practiced it long enough that the performance had become their actual response, genuine modesty woven in alongside the cultivated kind until the two were indistinguishable. There was a generosity embedded in the deflection that is worth acknowledging. By not accepting full credit, by directing the compliment elsewhere or dissolving it into circumstance, you were releasing the person who gave it from any obligation it might carry. You were making the compliment easy, weightless, something that could be offered freely without requiring a large transaction in return. The deflection was, in its way, a kindness to the person, complimenting you. It was also, of course, a kind of self-erasure, a habitual diminishment of your own effort and taste and judgment that, practiced over a lifetime, left certain women genuinely uncertain about the quality of their own work. Women who had spent decades insisting that no, really, the dress was nothing, the meal was simple, the house was easy, sometimes arrived at old age with a strange blankness about their own accomplishments, as though all that deflecting had eventually convinced them too. The humility they had performed so long had quietly become belief. And that, more than anything else about this particular rule, is what stays with you. One of the most ironclad rules of 1960s social life was the one that applied behind the closed doors of a marriage and then followed you outside them. You did not discuss your husband unfavourably in public, and you did not discuss the difficulties of your marriage at all. Not with neighbours, not with friends, not with your sister, unless you were very close and she was very discreet. The marriage was a private institution that projected a public face, and the face was always fine. This was the era of "we're very happy, and he works so hard and I really can't complain," delivered at garden parties and church socials and over the back fence, over and over, until the phrase became reflexive, a social tick that women deployed automatically in response to any question that came too close to the truth. The rule had a logic to it that made a particular kind of sense within the world it governed. A marriage was a household, and a household was a woman's primary domain and primary responsibility, and to speak poorly of it was to speak poorly of yourself, to admit that something under your care had gone wrong, that the thing you were most responsible for managing was not, in fact, being well managed. There was no neutral way to say my husband and I are struggling that did not also say, and I have not found a way to fix it, which was its own kind of admission in an era when fixing things was understood to be largely within a wife's power. So the difficulties stayed indoors. They lived in the particular silences that develop between a husband and wife, after years of things left unsaid, in the careful way a woman described her week when a neighbour asked, editing as she spoke, offering the version that was accurate enough to be honest but incomplete enough to be safe. They lived in the afternoons when the children were at school and the house was quiet and there was nothing to manage for a few hours except the weight of whatever was actually happening inside the marriage, which could be heavy or light depending on the week, and which most women carried without complaint because complaint had no socially acceptable destination. The irony was that women knew, not everything, but enough. You could read between the lines of a neighbour's careful language. You could hear, in the way someone said, "Oh, he's been very busy lately," the actual shape of whatever was going on behind that sentence. Women communicated in a register precise enough to convey the truth while maintaining the fiction, and the other women received it in the same register, understanding without acknowledging that they understood. It was a lonely system, even when it worked. The loneliness of having difficulty and being unable to name it directly, of being surrounded by women who almost certainly shared some version of your experience, but could only gesture toward it in the coded language the rules allowed. Some women broke the rules, trusted a friend enough to speak plainly, and found relief in the speaking. Others kept the code their entire lives. Both choices had costs, and neither was as simple as it looked from the outside. It is a weekday morning in the neighborhood now, and the sidewalks have a quiet rhythm to them. Women moving through their days, heading to the mailbox, pulling weeds from the front garden, chatting briefly over a fence before remembering something on the stove, and running through all of it, invisible but felt, were the unwritten rules of the neighborhood itself. You did not park in front of someone else's house unnecessarily. You did not let your lawn go ragged. You did not hang washing out on a Sunday. You did not play music loudly in the afternoon. And above all, you maintained a certain cheerful pleasantness toward everyone on the block, even the people you found difficult, even the woman 3 doors down whose children screamed and whose husband came home late. The neighborhood was its own small social contract, and a woman who violated its norms risked something harder to repair than a friendship. She risked her reputation. The lawn was the most visible part of the contract. In 1960s suburban America, a well-kept lawn was a public statement as legible as anything you might put in the newspaper. It said that the people inside the house were attentive, responsible, proud of what they had. A lawn that had gone several days without mowing in the height of summer, a garden bed that had been allowed to run to weeds, a front walk with leaves across it on a Monday morning. These were the kinds of things that registered on a block without ever being mentioned, settling quietly into the neighborhood's collective understanding of which households were being properly run. The washing line had its own grammar. Sheets hung smoothly and evenly spaced. Underwear tucked to the inner lines where it was less visible from the street. Colours grouped where possible, not for aesthetics exactly, but because disorder on the line suggested disorder within, and the line was one of the few domestic interiors that the street could read. Women who hung their washing with care were understood to keep their homes with the same care, and the assumption was usually correct. The sounds a house produced were carefully managed. A radio turned too high on a weekday afternoon was a small disturbance in the neighborhood's frequency, a hint that something inside that house was not quite calibrated correctly. Children's noise was more forgivable, children being children, but even that was monitored, and a mother whose children were consistently loud in the front yard developed a reputation that attached itself to the whole household. You kept your noise inside, or you kept it reasonable, because the street belonged to everyone and consideration was the tax you paid for living on it. The pleasantness toward difficult neighbours was perhaps the most genuinely demanding of all the unwritten rules, because it required sustained performance in the absence of reward. You waved at the woman 3 doors down even when you had spent the previous evening complaining about her privately. You stopped to chat briefly at the mailbox even when you had nothing to say, and less desire to say it. You brought a covered dish over when her family had been sick, because that was what the neighbourhood did, and you were part of the neighbourhood, and the neighbourhood's customs were larger than any individual feeling about any individual person. In this, as in so many things, the form was the substance. The cheerful wave performed often enough became, eventually, a genuine warmth. The covered dish delivered without enthusiasm became, in the memory of the woman who received it, a real act of care. The neighbourhood's rules shaped the neighbourhood's feeling, and the feeling was, on the best days, one of the loveliest things about that vanished world. A street of people who had agreed, without ever saying so, to take care of one another. In the 1960s, there was an etiquette to being sick that most people no longer remember, and would find astonishing today. A housewife who was unwell was expected to manage that illness as quietly and invisibly as possible. She did not take to her bed unless she truly could not stand. She did not mention her symptoms in social conversation unless they were severe enough to explain an absence. She did not allow her illness to disrupt the household schedule if it could be prevented, because the household schedule was her responsibility, and her inability to maintain it was not considered an excuse but a circumstance to be managed. Women powered through headaches, through colds, through the particular exhaustion of early pregnancy, through all of it, and they did so with the same composed pleasantness they applied to every other corner of their lives, because the alternative, letting it show, was a kind of admission that the whole elegant operation depended on her, which it did, and which everyone knew, and which was never supposed to be said aloud. The medicine cabinet of a 1960s housewife was a practical document, stocked not for comfort, but for function. Aspirin for headaches, a mentholated rub for chest colds, something for the stomach when the stomach required it. The goal of these remedies was not rest and recovery in the modern sense, not the full surrender to illness that the body sometimes required. The goal was management, getting well enough to continue, reducing the symptoms to a level that allowed the day to proceed more or less as planned. Illness was an interruption to be minimized, not an experience to be honored. She learned to gauge what she could absorb. A mild cold was manageable, even on a day with company coming. A fever required genuine negotiation with the schedule, a telephone call to rearrange something, a quiet word to her husband that dinner might be simpler than expected tonight. These disclosures were made as matter-of-factly as possible, without drama, without the expectation of sympathy that might require someone else to rearrange their day on her behalf. She'd been unwell. She was managing. Things would be fine. The children complicated this further, as children complicate most things. A sick child required tending, which meant the sick mother was tending a sick child while also being sick herself, an arrangement that most women of this era accepted as simply the nature of the situation. You did what needed doing. You made the soup and changed the sheets and sat on the edge of the bed reading aloud in a voice that came out steadier than you felt, because the child needed steadiness and you were the one responsible for providing it. The remarkable thing, looking back, is not that these women managed illness without complaint. It is that they managed it so completely that the people around them often did not know they had been ill at all until several days later, when they mentioned it in passing almost as an afterthought. "Oh, I had a terrible cold last week," delivered lightly, as though describing something that had happened to someone else, a minor incident in a week that had otherwise gone smoothly. The stoicism was real. So was the cost of it. The body, after all, does not negotiate as smoothly as a household schedule, and the debt it accumulates from being managed rather than rested has a way of presenting itself eventually, in ways that cannot be quietly absorbed and set aside. But that reckoning, when it came, was also managed privately, because that too was simply what was done. In the 1960s, punctuality was a moral category. To be late was not simply inconvenient, it was a statement about your character, your regard for others, your level of self-discipline and respect. A woman who arrived late to a social engagement had failed at something, and the nature of the failure was not logistical but personal. She had not planned correctly. She had not allowed sufficient time. She had, in some vague and damning way, valued her own comfort or convenience more than her obligation to the people waiting. And the correct response when you were late, having arrived flustered and apologetic, was not to explain the circumstances, not to describe the traffic or the child who couldn't find a shoe or the zipper that had stuck at the last moment. The correct response was a simple, sincere apology, delivered once and then dropped, because continuing to explain was considered self-indulgent, a way of making your lateness the topic of conversation when the evening had other, better things to be about. The preparation for leaving the house for a woman in this era was its own exercise in time management so intricate it could have been diagrammed. You dressed the children first because children required supervision during the dressing process and could not be trusted to remain clean and presentable if left to their own devices while you attended to yourself. Then you dressed yourself, which meant the makeup, the hair, the dress, the shoes, the gloves if the occasion called for them, the purse checked and restocked with whatever the evening might require. Then a final pass through the house, the stove checked, the back door locked, the light left on in the hallway. Then the children collected from wherever they had drifted during the interval between being dressed and being placed in the car. All of this required time that had to be built into the schedule deliberately, and the women who were reliably punctual were the ones who had learned to build in more time than they thought they needed, because something always required more time than it appeared to. The iron that needed reheating, the run that appeared in a stocking at the last moment, the child who had inexplicably lost one shoe in the 20 minutes since both shoes had been accounted for. These were not unusual events. They were simply Tuesday, and Tuesday had to be planned for. To arrive on time was to signal that you had anticipated all of these things and managed them. It was a statement of competence made without a single word, legible the moment you appeared in the doorway at precisely the right moment, composed and unhurried, as though the journey from your house to this one had been entirely without incident, which it had not been. But that was not the point. The point was that you had left early enough to absorb the incidents without wearing them. Being early carried its own social complications, which is why the guidance was always within 5 minutes of the stated time, never before. An early arrival placed a burden on the hostess who was not yet ready to receive, who was perhaps still in her own final preparations, still moving the last thing into place, still becoming the composed and gracious woman she intended to be by the time the doorbell rang. To arrive before she had finished becoming that woman was a small unkindness, an intrusion into the private machinery behind the public performance. The 5-minute window was the solution, a grace period wide enough to accommodate a traffic light or a missing glove, but narrow enough to communicate that you had taken the invitation seriously, that you had organised your afternoon around this. Commitment that the people inside that house were worth arriving on time for. And in a world where so much was communicated without being spoken, arriving on time was one of the clearest things you could say. There was a particular art form practiced by women in the 1960s that has no clean name exactly, but might be called the management of disagreement. Because a woman was not supposed to disagree directly, not loudly, not with the flat confidence of someone who was certain she was right and intended to say so plainly. If a woman held a different opinion from the person she was speaking with, especially a man she was speaking with, the rules of the era required her to arrive at that difference by a long and winding road. A gentle question, a thoughtful, a soft raising of a consideration rather than a contradiction. The disagreement was supposed to feel like an invitation rather than a confrontation. Women who mastered this became extraordinarily effective. But the cost of the mastery was that they often could not be heard when they said something plainly and clearly, because everyone was waiting for the softening that was supposed to come. The technique had a shape that experienced practitioners could execute in their sleep. You began with acknowledgement. You found something in the other person's position worth affirming, something real if possible, something you could agree with genuinely before gently introducing your reservation. Then came the reservation itself, wrapped in the language of uncertainty rather than conviction. I wonder if, or perhaps one might consider, or it's interesting because I'd always thought, each phrase designed to present your differing view as a question you were both exploring together rather than a position you were advancing against theirs. The question was the primary tool. A well-placed question could accomplish what a direct statement could not. It could introduce a contradiction without the friction of contradiction, could cause a person to reconsider without making them feel that they were being asked to reconsider, could shift the direction of a conversation so gradually that the person whose direction had been shifted often ended the evening believing the new course had been their own idea. Women who had refined this skill over years of social navigation could redirect an entire dinner table conversation with 3 or 4 carefully chosen questions and never once appear to have done anything more than express polite curiosity. It was sophisticated, this management of disagreement. It required intelligence and restraint and a precise understanding of social dynamics that far exceeded anything the era was willing to credit women with possessing. The women who did it best were often described simply as diplomatic or tactful or easy to talk to, adjectives that acknowledged the pleasant surface without noting the considerable architecture beneath it. The frustration of the method was its invisibility. Work that is designed to disappear does disappear, and the woman who had spent an entire evening carefully steering a conversation toward a better outcome received no credit for the steering because no one had seen the wheel. Her influence was real, and her effort was genuine, but both were absorbed into the texture of a pleasant evening and left no trace that could be pointed to afterward. What changed, gradually, as the decade wore on and the world outside those dining rooms began to shift, was that some women grew tired of the indirection. They had questions they wanted to ask plainly, positions they wanted to state without the softening architecture around them, disagreements they wanted to name as disagreements rather than dress as inquiries. The journey from the managed disagreement of 1962 to the direct speech of a decade later was not a simple one. And it was not comfortable for anyone in those rooms, but it was necessary, and it began, as most necessary things do, with someone deciding that the long way around had taken long enough. Sunday afternoon now, after the service, and the church hall is set up with folding tables and casserole dishes, and a dessert table that represents the competitive baking of 12 different women who would never admit they were competing. The church social was one of the primary theatres of 1960s social life, and it had its own elaborate grammar of behaviour. You brought something homemade, something that looked like it had taken effort even if the recipe was simple, even if you had been up since 6 finishing it. You presented it modestly. You accepted compliments on it with deflection and quiet pleasure. You did not stand near your own dish in a way that could be construed as hovering. You served others before serving yourself, and if your dish was not popular, if it sat largely untouched on the table while the neighbour's gelatin mould was scraped clean, you gave no sign that you had noticed. The preparation had begun on Saturday, or in some cases Thursday, depending on the dish and the ambition of the cook. A woman who brought something simple, a plate of cookies, a bowl of fruit salad, was making a statement about her relationship to the church social, one of comfortable participation rather than competitive investment. A woman who brought a 3-layer cake with hand-piped frosting was making a different statement entirely, and everyone in the hall could read it, even though no one would say so directly. The cake was its own form of communication, admired extravagantly and assessed privately. Its layers and its finish and its flavour, all quietly noted and filed away in the collective memory of women who would remember this cake the next time the church social came around. The serving of others first was non-negotiable. You did not approach the food table and fill your own plate. You found an elderly member who needed assistance, or you helped to serve the children, or you stood behind the table and offered portions to the people moving along the line. Your own meal was assembled last from whatever remained, and you assembled it without complaint and without the kind of pointed looking that communicated dissatisfaction. Whatever was left was sufficient. You were there for the community, not the casserole. The conversation at a church social was warm but monitored by its setting in ways that a private dinner party was not. Certain topics belonged indoors, in the privacy of a home. The church hall with its folding chairs and its paper tablecloths and its particular smell of coffee and warm dishes and wood polish, was a public space in a way that carried additional obligation. You were among your whole community here, not just your social circle, and the community included people with whom you had no particular intimacy, but toward whom you owed the full performance of your best self. You moved through the room with the ease of someone who was genuinely comfortable, even when you were not, stopping to speak with the women you knew less well, asking after their families, remembering the detail from last month's conversation that would demonstrate you had been listening when it was given. This was the texture of community maintenance, the small daily labour of keeping a neighbourhood knitted together, and women were its primary practitioners and its primary recipients. When the afternoon wound down, and the tables were cleared and the dishes were reclaimed and washed and dried and returned to the women who had carried them in that morning, there was a particular satisfaction in it that was not about the food at all. It was about having shown up, having contributed, having been part of something larger than your own household for an afternoon. That feeling, quiet and genuine and entirely unspoken, was perhaps the best thing the church social had to offer, and it cost nothing but the casserole let's end where the day ends in the quiet hour before bed, when the house is clean and the children are settled and the day is finally fully finished. This is the hour that belongs most completely to a 1960s housewife, and yet it is also the hour most shaped by what comes next. She lays out her husband's things for morning. She checks on the children one more time. She makes a mental list of what needs doing tomorrow, a list she carries in her head rather than writing down, because the writing down would make it visible, and the visibility would make it seem burdensome, and she's not supposed to seem burdened. She takes off her makeup and takes out her pins and becomes, briefly, just herself. And in the quiet of that small private moment, before sleep, before tomorrow's first demand, she exists outside the rules for just a little while. The house sounds different at this hour. The particular creak of a settling wall, the hum of the refrigerator carrying from the kitchen, the distant sound of a car moving through the neighbourhood and fading. These are the sounds that belong to the end of the day, soft and familiar, and she moves through them without thinking, her feet knowing the path between kitchen and bedroom in the dark the way they have always known it. She turns off the living room lamp. She checks the back door a second time, not because she doubts she locked it, but because the checking is part of the ritual, one of the small acts that closes the day properly. The children's rooms are visited one last time. She stands in each doorway for a moment, not long enough to disturb them, just long enough to see the shape of them under their blankets, the particular stillness of a sleeping child that is unlike any other stillness in the world. She adjusts a cover. She lifts a stuffed animal from the floor and tucks it back into the crook of a small arm. She pulls the door to, not fully closed, leaving the familiar inch of hallway light that means she's still there, still, awake, still the person standing between them and the dark. Then her own room, and the nightly unwinding that is also a kind of private ceremony. The pins come out of her hair slowly, one by one set on the dresser in a small row. Her hair falls loose around her shoulders, and she runs her brush through it with long unhurried strokes, the kind of motion that requires nothing from her except to keep going, and the simplicity of that is its own relief after a day of constant calibrated effort. The makeup comes off with cold cream and a soft cloth. The face that looks back from the mirror is the one that belongs to no one but herself. This is the hour the etiquette guides never addressed, because it existed outside their jurisdiction. No one was watching. No one was being hosted or impressed or considered. The rules released their grip here, and what remained was simply a woman at the end of a long day, in a quiet house, finally permitted to be tired. She was tired most evenings. The kind of tired that sits behind the eyes and lives in the lower back and does not entirely leave even after a full night of sleep. But it was also, on the best evenings, a satisfying tiredness, the particular weight of a day that had been fully inhabited, every hour attended to, every obligation met. She set down her brush, she turned off the lamp, she settled into the familiar dark of her own room, her own pillow, her own particular corner of the life she'd built and maintained, and would begin again tomorrow. And for a few hours at least it was enough simply to rest inside it. And now, before we close the door on this kitchen and this neighbourhood and this particular vanished world, let's sit with the women who lived inside these rules for a moment longer. Because the rules were real, and the women were real, and what they carried was not a simple thing. They carried the weight of 100 small expectations from the moment they woke to the moment they slept, and they carried it with a grace that looked from the outside like ease. Some of them found genuine satisfaction in it. Some of them were quietly miserable. Some were both, sometimes on the same afternoon. And many of them would look back decades later with a complicated tenderness for the women they had been, living inside those beautiful, suffocating days, doing their best with the world they had been handed. What they carried was not only the rules themselves, but the entire invisible infrastructure that made the rules function. The anticipation of other people's needs, the management of other people's comfort, the constant low hum of social awareness that never fully switched off, that was always measuring the temperature of the room, noting the expression that crossed someone's face a half second before they smoothed it away, adjusting in response before the adjustment was even consciously decided upon. This vigilance was exhausting in a way that had no clean name and no recognized category, because it produced nothing visible, left no finished object at the end of the day that could be pointed to as evidence of labour. It simply kept everything running, the way a well-tuned engine keeps a car moving, its work invisible precisely because it is working. They carried, too, the particular loneliness of competence. The better you were at managing everything, the less anyone understood that there was anything to manage. A household that ran beautifully was a household that appeared to run itself, and the woman at the centre of it became, in the eyes of the people she served, simply the background condition of their comfort, invisible in her success. Noticed mainly in the rare moments of failure, when the dinner was late or the shirt was not where it was supposed to be, or the social event did not go quite as planned. Some of them carried dreams they had set aside so long ago, the setting aside no longer felt like loss. A year of college before the marriage, a talent for drawing, or music or writing that had never been developed past a certain point, a curiosity about the world that the shape of their days did not have room for. These things did not disappear. They lived quietly in the space between obligations, surfacing occasionally in the hour before bed or the Sunday afternoon when the children were occupied and the house was briefly still. They were not grieved, exactly. They were simply held gently and privately, the way you hold something you have no immediate use for but cannot bring yourself to put down entirely. And yet, what they also carried was genuine. The love for their children, uncomplicated and enormous. The pride in a home well kept, a meal well cooked, a friendship well tended. The satisfaction of a day that had required everything and produced something real, a family fed and clothed and held together, a neighbourhood maintained, a community supported in all its small and daily ways. These were not nothing. They were, in fact, considerable, and the women who understood them as such lived inside their days with a fullness that no list of restrictions can entirely account for. The world has changed enormously since those kitchens and those folding tables and those careful gloves. The rules these women live by are gone, or mostly gone, replaced by different expectations that carry their own weight and their own complications. What remains is something harder to name, a debt of attention perhaps, owed to the women who built their lives inside a world that asked so much of them and credited them so little. They deserved more acknowledgement than they received, and they carried on anyway, which, in its way, is the most human thing of all. It is mid-morning now, and somewhere on the block a telephone is ringing. That particular sound, bright and insistent, cutting through the quiet of a weekday house, was one of the defining sounds of 1960s domestic life. The telephone was essential and it was social, and it was, like everything else in a housewife's day, governed by rules that nobody had written down in a single place, but that everyone understood completely. You did not call too early in the morning. You did not call during the dinner hour. You did not call too late in the evening. You didn't keep someone on the line so long that their own household began to suffer for the absence of their attention. And when you answered pleasantly, with your name or a warm hello, because the telephone was a threshold between your private home and the outside world, and the impression you made at that threshold mattered. The timing of a call required genuine consideration. Before 9 in the morning was too early, an intrusion into the household's first hours that suggested either an emergency or a serious lapse in social judgment. After 8:30 in the evening was too late, an imposition on the quiet hours that belonged to a family's private winding down, the acceptable window, sat between those boundaries, and within it there were further calibrations. Mid-morning, after the breakfast things were cleared and the children were at school, was generally considered the most natural time for a social call. Early afternoon carried a slight risk of interrupting a nap, either a child's or occasionally a mother's, though the latter was rarely admitted. Late afternoon, in the hour before the dinner preparations began in earnest, was acceptable for a brief exchange but not a long one. The length of the call was its own negotiation. A woman who kept her friends on the telephone for an hour every morning was understood to be a woman with perhaps too much time and too few other obligations, a quiet judgment that nobody voiced but everyone registered. The ideal call was warm and purposeful, and concluded itself naturally within a reasonable span, leaving both parties feeling connected without either feeling that the morning had been consumed. Women developed an instinct. For the moment, a call was ready to end, a slight shift in the rhythm of the conversation, a natural pause that signalled completion, and they moved toward that moment with the same graceful efficiency they brought to clearing a table. The content of telephone conversations was also subtly regulated by the knowledge that privacy on the telephone was not guaranteed. Party lines, which many households still shared in the early part of the decade, meant that a neighbour might be listening at any moment, and even private lines carried the awareness that the telephone was not quite the same as a whispered confidence in someone's kitchen. You did not say anything on the telephone that you would not have been comfortable saying in a room where you were not entirely sure who else was present. This was not paranoia. It was a reasonable response to a technology that was still young enough to feel slightly public, even when it was theoretically private. What the telephone gave women of this era, within all those constraints, was something genuinely precious. Connection, maintained across the distances of a suburban landscape that could be isolating in ways that are difficult to fully convey from the outside. The morning call to a friend, brief and warm and woven into the fabric of the day, was one of the primary ways women sustained each other through the long hours of domestic life. A conversation that lasted 20 minutes could carry a woman through an entire afternoon, the warmth of it persisting long after the receiver had been replaced in its cradle. The telephone was, for all its rules, one of the quiet lifelines of that world, and the women who used it well understood exactly what it was worth. Sunday morning arrives with its own particular quality of light, softer than weekday morning somehow, the neighbourhood quieter in a way that feels deliberate rather than accidental, and in houses up and down the block, women are already attending to what is, by the standards of the 1960s, one of the most important dressing decisions of the week. Church clothes were not simply nice clothes, they were a specific category with specific requirements, and getting them right was a matter of genuine social consequence in a community where Sunday services were the most public and most observed gathering of the week. You dressed for church the way you dress for no other occasion, with a care that acknowledged you were going somewhere that deserved your best, and your best had to be exactly that. The hat was the starting point. In the early 1960s, a woman did not go to church without something on her head. This was not merely tradition. For many women of faith, it carried genuine religious significance, and for all of them it carried social significance of the most legible kind. The hat communicated at a glance that you understood where you were and what the occasion required of you. It could be modest or it could be beautiful, a simple pillbox or a more elaborate construction of fabric and trim, but it had to be present and it had to be appropriate, which meant not so plain as to seem indifferent and not so dramatic as to draw attention away from the service and toward itself. The dress or suit beneath the hat followed its own rules. Dark colours for winter, lighter ones as spring arrived. Nothing sleeveless, nothing that sat above the knee in a way that would cause anyone to look twice. The hemline question in the 1960s was genuinely complicated, as fashions shifted and shortened throughout the decade, and the church was often the last place where the older hemline held its ground. A woman who wore to Sunday service the same length she might wear to a weekday lunch with friends risked a particular kind of attention she did not want. The brief, lowered glance of women who had noticed and would remember. Gloves remained in church longer than they remained almost anywhere else. Even as they disappeared from daily life through the middle years of the decade, they persisted on Sunday mornings, held in laps during the service, drawn on again before walking out into the light. White or cream in warm weather, darker shades in cooler months, they were the final element that completed the Sunday ensemble and signalled to everyone in the pew that this woman had taken the morning seriously. The children were dressed to match the occasion, which meant their Sunday clothes were kept separate from their everyday clothes and guarded with a vigilance that the children themselves found baffling and the mothers found entirely reasonable. A grass stain on a Sunday dress was not merely a laundry problem. It was a failure of supervision made visible at the precise moment when you were most observed. The children were dressed, inspected, and reminded of the rules in the car on the way, and then they were delivered to their seats and expected to honour the preparation that had gone into them. Sitting in that pew on a Sunday morning, hat straight, gloves in lap, children settled beside you, was one of the few moments of the week when the work of preparation was briefly, publicly visible. The rest of the time it disappeared into its own results. But here, in the particular stillness of a Sunday service, the effort showed, and the showing was understood by every woman in every pew around you, each of them having made the same effort, each of them knowing exactly what it had cost. The quiet solidarity of that shared understanding was, in its way, its own form of grace. There is an end to every gathering, and in the 1960s that end was governed by its own careful choreography. Leaving a social occasion was not simply a matter of standing up and walking to the door. It was a sequence, a ritual with a shape and a timing, and several opportunities for getting things wrong. And the women who navigated it well did so with the same practiced ease they brought to every other element of social life. You did not leave too early, which signalled that you had not enjoyed yourself or had somewhere more important to be. You did not stay so long that the hostess, exhausted and ready for her own quiet, had to begin making the subtle signals that the evening was finished. You found the moment, the natural pause in the conversation, the slight shift in the room's energy that indicated completion, and you moved toward the door with warmth and grace, and a timing so well calibrated that it felt to everyone present entirely natural. The goodbye itself had a sequence that most women of this era followed instinctively. You thanked the hostess first, specifically and genuinely, naming something about the evening that had been particularly lovely, the meal, a conversation, the flowers on the table. This was not flattery. It was the correct acknowledgement of effort, the verbal equivalent of the thank you note that would follow within 2 days, a preview of the gratitude that was coming in more permanent form. Then you said your goodbyes to the other guests, brief and warm, expressing pleasure at having seen them, perhaps referencing something from the evening's conversation to demonstrate that you had been genuinely present and would carry a piece of the evening with you. The coats were collected with a certain ceremony. The hostess retrieved them, or directed an assistant to do so, and the putting on of coats was a moment of comfortable bustle that softened the transition between the warmth of the gathering and the night outside. Women helped each other with coats, holding them open, smoothing collars, a small physical courtesy that was also a final moment of connection before the evening dissolved. Gloves were drawn on, purses were collected. Children, if they were present, were located and assembled and reminded once more of their manners for the goodbye. At the door, there was often a pause. Not a long one, but a real one, a moment of standing on the threshold between inside and outside where the evening was briefly held before being released. A few final words, an expression of anticipation for the next occasion, a warmth that was genuine precisely because the evening had been good and everyone knew it. Then the door opened and the night air arrived and the spell broke cleanly, and you walked to your car with the pleasant warmth of a good evening still settled round your shoulders. The drive home had its own quality, different from the drive there. The anticipation was gone, replaced by something more settled, a comfortable review of the evening's pleasures and the people you had spent it with. You discussed it with your husband if he'd been there, trading observations in the shorthand of two people who had attended the same event, but experienced slightly different versions of it. You noted what had gone well. You noted quietly and privately, and never to be repeated outside the car, anything that had not. By the time you arrived home and the door of your own house closed behind you, the evening had been properly concluded. Not abandoned, not escaped, but finished with the same care that had been brought to its beginning. Because in this world, how you left mattered just as much as how you arrived. Here is something worth pausing on, because it sits at the heart of so much of what made the 1960s housewife's life what it was. She was not supposed to have opinions, or more precisely, she was not supposed to have opinions that she expressed openly, consistently and without apology, the way a person with full social standing expresses opinions. She could have preferences, mild and domestically oriented. She could have tastes in curtain fabric and casserole recipes and the correct length of a thank you note. She could observe and respond and contribute to conversations that others had initiated. But the woman who arrived at a social occasion with strong views she intended to share on politics, on religion, on the management of the country or the neighbourhood or the school board, was moving outside the boundaries of what the era considered appropriate femininity, and she felt the friction of that movement immediately in the slight shift of attention, the brief exchange of glances across the table that communicated without a word that she had said something that required managing. This did not mean women had no opinions. The private life of a 1960s housewife was often richly opinionated, full of precisely observed judgments about the world around her, delivered with wit and clarity to the friends she trusted enough to be honest with. In her own kitchen, with her neighbour leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee, a woman could be as sharp and as certain and as direct as her intelligence allowed. The opinions existed. They simply had designated spaces, and those spaces were not the dinner table or the church social or the conversation with her husband's colleague's wife. The women who found this constraint most difficult were often the most intelligent, which makes a particular kind of painful sense. A woman with a powerful mind and a genuine interest in the world, who had read widely and thought carefully and arrived at considered views on things that mattered, was required to ration that mind in public, in a way that her less intellectually restless contemporaries simply did not experience as a constraint. For them, the boundaries of acceptable conversation felt natural enough. For her, they felt like a room with a low ceiling, one she was constantly aware of and occasionally furious about and almost never permitted to mention. Some women found outlets. The school board was one, a venue where a woman's opinions about education and community were not only acceptable but sought, where her intelligence could operate closer to its full capacity without transgressing the social codes that governed more purely social occasions. Church committees offered similar terrain. The Women's Auxiliary, the Neighbourhood Association, the book club where the books were real and the discussions genuine, these were the spaces where something closer to the full person could appear. The book club deserves its own moment of recognition, because it was often far more than it appeared. A group of women meeting weekly to discuss a novel were also, in practice, discussing the world, using the novel as a safe container for ideas and arguments that the social rules of the era would not have accommodated in a more direct form. The characters in the book could be examined and judged and argued over with a freedom that real people in real conversations could not quite be afforded. It was opinion, exercised in the only gymnasium the era reliably left open. And the women who gathered in those living rooms, books in hand, talking about characters who were living the lives they were not living, were not simply passing the time, they were keeping something alive in themselves that the rest of the week was always quietly asking them to put down. Let's stay here for a moment, in the last quiet of this particular world, before we step back into our own, because there is something that deserves to be said plainly, something that gets lost when we talk about this era only in terms of its restrictions, only as a set of rules to be catalogued and marvelled at from a comfortable distance. The women who lived these days were not simply victims of their moment, not simply people to be pitied for the constraints they operated within. They were fully human, complex and capable and various, and they built lives inside those constraints that contained real beauty, real connection, real satisfaction, alongside everything that was difficult and limiting and quietly wrong. Both things were true. The era was genuinely restrictive and genuinely inhabited, and holding both of those truths at once is the only honest way to look back at it. What was lost when this world gave way to the one that followed was not nothing. The particular texture of a neighbourhood where women were home during the day, where the street had a human presence throughout its hours, where a child could knock on almost any door and find someone who knew their name and would give them a glass of water without a second thought. That texture dissolved as women moved into the workforce and the streets emptied during daylight hours in a way they never had before. The casserole brought to a sick neighbour, the eye kept on a child 3 houses down, the web of daily small attentions that kept a community knitted together. These things did not automatically transfer to a world organised differently, and some of them did not transfer at all. The art of hospitality, practised at the level these women practised it, has also thinned in the decades since. The properly set table, the meal prepared with genuine care, the hosting of an evening with attention, to every comfort of every guest, these things require time and intention, and a willingness to make the work invisible, and the world that followed this one had less patience for invisibility and less time for the kind of preparation that produced it. What we gained in honesty about labour, in the rightful insistence that domestic work be acknowledged rather than disappeared, we sometimes traded for the ease and care that the work, when it was done well and willingly, produced. What remains is harder to see clearly because we are still inside it, still working out what to carry forward and what to rightly set down. The thank you note is still worth writing. The table is still worth setting with care. The attention to another person's comfort, the anticipation of their needs before they have to name them, is still one of the most genuine forms of love available to us, regardless of who practices it or in what context. These things didn't belong to the rules that constrained women. They belonged to the women themselves, and the women took them with them when the rules changed. What those women handed forward, underneath all the etiquette and all the restriction, was something older and more durable than any social code. The understanding that a life well lived is one in which other people are genuinely considered, where the effort of making someone feel welcomed and cared for is understood as worthwhile, where the daily labour of maintaining connection is treated as the serious and necessary work that it actually is. The rules they lived by were imperfect and often unjust, and the world was right to change them. But the care behind the rules, the genuine human impulse to tend and to welcome and to show up and to stay, that was never wrong. And it never went away. It simply waited patiently for a world that would finally let anyone practice it. And so the day is finally, fully done. The percolator has gone cold on the counter. The good china has been washed and returned to the cabinet. The table that was set so carefully this morning sits empty now, its cloth smoothed back into place, the silverware quiet in its drawer. Somewhere down the street a porch light is still on, casting its small warm circle onto the front walk. The neighbourhood has folded itself into the evening, and the women who moved through it all day, who managed and maintained and attended and appeared, have finally, gratefully, stepped out of the day and into the dark. We have walked a long way together tonight, through kitchens and church halls and dinner parties and grocery store aisles, through the careful choreography of a properly set table and the invisible labour of a hostess who made everything look effortless, through the handshake that required calculation and the compliment that required deflection and the disagreement that had to be wrapped in the language of a question before it was safe to say aloud. We have sat in those living rooms and felt the weight of what these women carried, the 100 small expectations, the relentless vigilance, the opinions held quietly in rooms that were not yet ready to receive them. And we have also felt something else, something harder to name but just as real, the genuine pride of a woman standing back from a table she has set with her own hands, the warmth of a neighbourhood that knew your name and would bring you soup when you were sick and keep an eye on your children without being asked. The particular satisfaction of a day fully inhabited, every hour attended to, every obligation met with grace. The book club on a Thursday afternoon where the talk went deeper than the books, where women who spent the rest of their week managing themselves in public were briefly, gratefully allowed to simply think out loud. These were real things, they mattered, and the women who built their lives around them were not simply waiting for the world to change. They were living fully and completely in the world they had. Before we close tonight, I want to take a genuine moment to thank you for being here. If you have watched this far, if you have stayed through all of it, the early morning mirror and the grocery store and the church social and the long quiet hour before bed, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. You're curious about the past in the right way, not to romanticize it, not to dismiss it, but to understand it, to sit inside it long enough to feel what it actually felt like to be a person living there. That kind of attention is a gift, and I am grateful for it every single time. If this video meant something to you tonight, please consider leaving a like. It is a small thing that makes a genuinely large difference in whether these videos find the people who would love them. And if you are not yet subscribed, this would be a lovely moment to do that, so that the next time we wander somewhere together, you will already be here waiting. The comment section is always open, and I read more of it than you might expect. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me about the woman in your own life who carried some version of what we talked about tonight. Your grandmother, your mother, someone whose life contained more than the world gave her credit for. I want to hear about her. And if you prefer to listen rather than watch, the channel is now on Spotify. which feels like a natural home for this kind of storytelling. The link is in the description, tucked there quietly, waiting for you whenever you are ready. Now, the video is ending and the evening is yours, and I want you to take it gently. If you're somewhere comfortable right now, stay there a little longer. Let the blanket stay where it is. Let the fan keep running. You do not have to be anywhere or do anything, or manage any impression of yourself for anyone for the rest of tonight. That is a freedom the women we spent this evening with did not always have. And it is worth noticing just for a moment how much it is worth. There is a woman somewhere in your family tree who set a table carefully and kept her opinions behind her teeth and ironed a shirt before sunrise and carried it all with grace and rarely, if ever, heard anyone say thank you in proportion to what the work deserved. So let this be a small, quiet thank you, sent backward through the years to wherever she is. She did more than anyone counted. She held more than anyone saw. And the world she made possible, the one you are resting inside right now, was built in part from her hands and her patience and her particular, unwitnessed excellence. Good night, friends. Wherever you are, I hope the quiet finds you, and I hope you rest in the way that she, on too many evenings, simply could not.